Welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My guest today is the legendary Clint de Ganon.
Thanks. Good to be here, Clayton.
I'm glad you can do this. I see behind you, you have something that's very interesting. You have two things, but I want to talk about the first thing that's right behind you. It's a poster of Manny's Car Wash.
Inshallah.
I remember going there several times to go to their blues jam session.
Oh, did you?
Were you part of was there a house band at that time?
If there was, I didn't know about that. The when I played at Manny's was it was a blues club, and you remember, and it was on the Upper East Side.
Yes.
I would play there with the band that I was working with at the time, which was the late great Hiram Bullock, and we had a trio with the great Will Lee, and we wound up doing a live record there. And this poster behind me is Live at Manny's Car Wash is the name of the record. And it was, a period of time. We had done a number of gigs, and Hiram was a one in a row, just an amazing guitar player, and some people say one of the greatest, if not the greatest, since Hendrix. Anyway. It was a very creatively fertile stage, and you could and we were, we did things on that record and played songs on that record that we hadn't even rehearsed or never played before.
Oh wow!
So Hiram was in that phase, and Will and Hiram go way back. I was kind of the new guy in the band, and they could move the thing in any different direction they wanted to, and we all sang, and that was part of it. Yeah, it was Hiram sang most of the leads, but every now and then a lead line would go to Will or me. And then when we did gigs in Japan and got more comfortable, that was kind of the early phase of that particular trio. Then we would each sing songs. Hiram mostly, but Will and I would also have a song or two to sing. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. Really, really special time for me.
So, not only Hiram Bullock, but the Blues Brothers, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Chuck Loeb, Curtis Stigers, Cornell Dupree, man, Cissy Houston, Edgar Winter, and that's just to name a few. And the shows that you've done, because this is basically dedicated to people that want to learn about Broadway musicals.
Sure.
You were on Hairspray for many, many years. Beautiful. And let me ask you one starting question. Was your first Broadway show Footloose?
No, my first Broadway show was kind of a fluky thing that came. It was called Stardust, and Stardust. I was a kid, early 20s. I had gone out with I'd gone on a tour, and the show was called The American Dance Machine. They may be around in one form or another now, but the American Dance Machine was a touring. They had a Broadway moment before I joined, but it was a touring show that took highlights of dances from different shows and pieced them together in one. And so great dancers. And the MD was a guy named Jim Raitt, who's no longer with us. He wound up getting this show, Stardust. He said, "Can you do this off-Broadway show?" I did. And it ran off-Broadway for, I don't know, maybe, I'm guessing now, a number of months, maybe 6 months, maybe more, maybe 8 months. And then it moved to Broadway and lasted, a couple months. And it was a review. And the show was lyricist Mitchell Parrish, all his songs, which included Stardust. And it was that was that. And Andre DeShields was in it. I remember so this is a long time ago. He was one of maybe the 4 featured singers, and that's what it was. It was like a Smokey Joe's Cafe format where you introduce the thing, you sing the songs, and that was my first show.
Well, let's go back to your beginning as a drummer, as a musician. You started when you were 6 years old, and you Did you grow up in New York City or Westchester?
Well, yeah. So I spent the first year of my life in Brooklyn. Then we went to Cincinnati, and we were there for a few years. Moved to Westchester, Hastings-on-Hudson, when I was 4. And at the time when we moved there, my best friend, was across the street. Still a very close friend of mine. His older brother played drums. He had his name is Pete Edelman. My buddy's Jeff. Anyway, he had a champagne sparkle kit that was either Slingerland or Rogers, I can't remember. And he played, rock beats, and I would go over to the house and I would check him out, and I was fascinated. I mean, you probably have some similar thing, some bug that bit you, where just the actual sort of physicality of the drums themselves, along with the primal nature of what it is, just grabs you, right? And that's when it grabbed me. I mean, at the time he was playing, I was probably like 4 or 5. And then my dad got me a couple of drums. It was like a bass drum and a snare drum, no pedal, no stands. And so I lay them on the floor and I sat on the floor, and, he gave me a pair of drumsticks, and I would, make beats on the bass drum lying on the floor and the snare drum lying on the floor. So ultimately, I took lessons at the local music store. That was at 6 or 7 or something.
So I understand you studied with Sonny Igoe. Was that?
Well, that if you fast forward, I had another teacher in between, a local guy named Phil Grice, and then at a point when it was time to move on, at Hastings there was I have to mention this guy named Pete DeLuke. He was a mentor. He was our stage band, concert band, and marching band teacher. Pete DeLuke, who's now retired, of course, but he was a saxophone player, and he had toured with like Stan Kenton and I think Woody Herman, but some major big bands. So he had this love of teaching, and he also was a real jazz musician. So it was so fortunate for me. But anyway, he plugged into like the local guys locally who were great players. So Gene Krupa, Stan Getz, and Mel Lewis, right, were all in the periphery. Gene was in Yonkers, Stan was in Irvington, and Mel Lewis was in Tarrytown. So Mel would come and occasionally sit down with me and show me some things. And I was a kid, at the time. I mean, probably like 8th or 9th grade. When it came time to look for a teacher, I said, "Can I study with you?" He's like, "No," because he really was an unorthodox technical player, right? And he didn't teach much, and it wasn't what he was going to do. So he sent me to Sonny. You had to audition for Sonny.
Wow.
And Sonny turned people down. I mean, everybody wanted to study with Sonny. So Sonny was in the Henry Adler building. That was a building that was on 46th Street and had, at one point or another, Ed Shaughnessy and Charlie Persip and a bunch, but it was all drummers. Henry Adler, of course, was there. Sonny was at the very end of the hall, up some stairs. So I went there and sat down with him my first time. And, he said, play some of this and play some of that. And he said, well, Mel sent you, and you obviously have talent, but you play like a pussycat. Now, I remember the story differently, and of course, Tommy and I have had discussions about this. I remember him not adding the word cat to the end. He thinks differently. I thought differently, but anyway, Sonny insists that he didn't say that later on. But whatever, it was I spent about 5 years studying with Sonny.
So what do you think he meant by that? You play too soft?
Yeah, I think he meant that I didn't really have a technique. My hands were not developed enough, so there was musicality, for a, a guy that age. However, I think I might have been 16 at the time or something. But you know, so I would take the train in and study with him every week. And I worked with him for 4 or 5 years, even through college. And I also got a symphonic percussion, an orchestral percussion teacher at the time, a guy named Larry Wilson. Larry was a disciple of Saul Goodman's, and so was the guy I ultimately studied with, which was Roland Koloff. He was the timpanist of the New York Philharmonic. So anyway, I was doing these things because at the time when I was planning, when I went to college, playing drums as a major, if you were a music major and your ticket was the main instrument was playing drum set in my periphery, Berklee was the only answer. My folks were like you to get a fuller education. They were more about, so I went to the only place at the time that Koloff was teaching, and it was a liberal arts education, and it was a good one, and studied with him. And then when I was out, studied with Gary Chester for a year or two. Studied with Buster Bailey, who was, many people consider like the greatest concert snare drummer. He was also in the Philharmonic for a couple of years. And ultimately Michael Carvin, studied with him a little bit, a great jazz drummer. Those were my teachers. But I do want to tell you one thing. So in high school, the first year I got into the stage band, which was a really good band, they were like competing in the Northeast. They had come in second 2 years in a row at Berklee School of Music in the jazz band competition. By the time I got in there, Gene Krupa had already done, they had annual benefit concerts for the kids. If they went, they were going to go to school, this would help them. There was money raised from these concerts. So the kids would play in their stage band, and then these great artists would play. Unbelievable. So my first year, I was like, Gene Krupa's coming. And he couldn't come, but he had somebody drive a pair of his drumsticks to Hastings High School for the drummer that he never even met, which was truly
Getting to you
on stage. Gene Krupa would like to give these drumsticks to the drummer. What a sweet man, right? So ultimately, and Mel would come every year and play, and Stan Getz would play, and Dave Brubeck played. One year, Buddy Rich came, and I was a huge Buddy Rich fan. There was a place called, he had a club called Buddy's Place, but he had actually two locations for Buddy's Place. He would play there all the time. So imagine a club called Buddy's Place where you could see Buddy playing constantly, right?
Where was it?
This one was on 60s, I want to say 61st Street and 2nd Avenue, somewhere right there. You had to walk up one flight of stairs and then you were there. At the time, he had, I want to say like a septet, which included Anthony Jackson, who was like, at the time, I think he may have been 18 or 19, no older.
Wow.
It was an unbelievable band. And I was a kid, and, sometimes Mel would take me to the Vanguard to see Thad Jones' Mel Lewis Orchestra, which ultimately became the Vanguard Orchestra. I had a rich high school experience, right? It was very nurturing. So when I was in my junior year, time for this annual concert, Buddy Rich was a guest, and Mel Lewis, and they played together on the stage. Anyway, Buddy was my idol, and I was looking for some excuse to talk to him. So I had just played, and I went over to, I was like, Mr. Rich, is there anything I can, a little kid going over and he grabbed my hand, and he said, son, you're a great drummer. You keep playing. And if he had grabbed my hand and said, son, think about doing something else. Because Buddy was notorious, he had a temper, and he, by all accounts, he could be difficult. But that day, I saw him holding babies. He was like smiling. He was the nicest, sweetest man. And that was my experience playing for Buddy. The next year, there was a great saxophonist arranger named Frank Foster. He lived in Scarsdale, and he brought me to a rehearsal in Harlem for some gig that was about to happen at Glen Island Casino. And he was going to have me and the tenor player play, on a tune or two at Glen Island Casino with his band. It was like the most unbelievable thing, right? So we got to Glen Island Casino, and who was the drummer that I'm listening to, and that is ultimately going to put his drumsticks down and have me come up and play? Elvin Jones.
Really? Wow.
Who was smiling and laughing, and I just remember getting behind the kid. Did you ever hear that Bill Cosby routine where it's about where he was a drummer when he was younger, and he has to play Cherokee. He sits and he's playing ting 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 ting, and his hand starts to get really tired, and he feels like it's going to fall off. And it wasn't Cherokee, but it was something like that. And I had no idea where one was. I just knew where the pulse was, and I was going like this. And Elvin was over there laughing, and but. I mean, I tell you these things because as we lead up to this other stuff, the fuel of being a musician, of being thrilled with jazz, being thrilled with music, being nurtured, studying, and following conductor also, because I played in concert band, I played in orchestra in high school, and all of that. All of it played in. I hadn't played a show yet. But I had done a lot of playing, and that continued through college.
When you were in high school, did you have dreams of being a rock star, playing in the Philharmonic, playing on Broadway, playing in jazz clubs? Did you have an ultimate goal, or was it you just wanted to play?
It's a good question. I was thrilled with music. And I always loved, I knew I wanted to be a musician. And the drums were a vehicle, because music was the bigger thing. But I wasn't really cognizant of the ways to make money. And at some point in high school, I got turned on to CTI, which was a label that produced all this great music, and you know it. And they recorded all the stuff at Rudy Van Gelder's place in Englewood, New Jersey, or Englewood Cliffs. Anyway, you could hear Bob James and Grover Washington and Freddie Hubbard and Jim Hall and Milt Jackson, all these great jazz artists. But it was a predecessor to the fusion, I think, of jazz and jazz and pop music, jazz and rock, jazz and R&B, fusion sort of. But anyway, that's the first time, and I was really into Billy Cobham at one point, and I bought one of the records. It was a Milt Jackson record called Sunflower. I had Little Sunflower on it, and Herbie and all these great drum players were on it. And Steve Gadd was on. I didn't know who Steve Gadd was, and I actually avoided listening to I kept honing on Billy Cobham's tracks because he was playing with Mahavishnu, and then ultimately he had his own. Anyway, I heard Steve, and I was like, wow, even as a high school. And then I thought, what I really want to do is be a studio musician. Because there was something that was always more fascinating to me about playing in the recording studio and sounding good and plugging into all these different kinds of music. It was more fascinating to me than any other aspect of playing. And actually, honestly, remains so. So, I love playing live. I could sit in the studio all day, day after day. And in a way, I wish that's what New York still was, because there was a point when it was, when guys were doing that.
Some of the musicians that I speak with on this podcast were part of that scene back then.
Yeah.
Eventually I like to speak to somebody like Buddy Williams, who was like doing it all the time.
Yeah.
But talking to Ray Marchica and other people, he even talked about the number that was part of Radio Registry, which I keep forgetting, 212 JU.
JU2 8800.
Yes, yeah, something like that. 8,000.
Larry Saltzman, yeah, that might have been it. Larry Saltzman actually had it once as his email address, just to commemorate. It was, and if you know Larry, it's like,
Yes.
perfect. But he, in a way, he was commemorating and celebrating that, because it was such an abundant time. When you think about it, Clayton, it wasn't that long ago that every note of music had to be made by people. I mean, we think of it as like, well, yeah, that's ancient. It's not. I mean, stuff didn't start to automate really until the 80s. I understand that's 40 years ago. 40 years ago seems like a lifetime to many. 40 years is not that long ago in the scheme of things. And then ultimately, you had drum machines that came in, and between that and many other things kind of killed the studio business as we know it. But at one point it was quite fruitful.
Did you break into the studio scene in the 70s and 80s?
I would say the answer to that question, quite honestly, is yes and no. So I was never as busy as, because I was young, right? So as I came into that scene, it was already beginning to dwindle. But I did my fair share of not records as much as jingles, and there were companies that I would work for sometimes. Even wrote one. It even went national. It's Trident. I think it was Trident. But there were guys certainly that were doing more of that for longer than I was, but I did it long enough and enjoyed it long enough to have gotten a taste of what that really was. And then it began to disappear. As it began to disappear, the prospect of doing shows became more palatable for people who ordinarily would not have appeared on that scene. Rhythm section players who were just too busy playing in the studios and live gigs and stuff like that, and there was really no reason to sort of move in the direction of a show. It wasn't considered what it is now. And I must admit that I carry some of that with me, that sense, because we didn't celebrate. We never, guys of my age never really celebrated. It was commerce, and we were grateful to have it. And there was certainly some music you could play that was better than others, and the level of musicians certainly went up. But we kind of knew what it was. You know what I equated to when I was doing jingles, and I was thrilled to get a jingle. It was the greatest thing in the world. I didn't give a shit that it was like a 30-second spot for, peanut butter or whatever. And, you'd look around the room and it was like my heroes were there. They didn't want it. They were looking at their watches. It was the last place they wanted to be. They wanted to make money. It was about making money, right? And they got the great players, and they were happy to be able to make the money. But what they really wanted to do is play real music, right? So in a way, I see the same dichotomy, that same sort of thing, but the jingles were ultimately replaced by shows for a bunch of us, and we were grateful and are grateful to have them, but we frame it for what it is now. If you're an actor, a whole different animal. You're the performer. This is this is what you're going for, and you flesh out a role and you do all that. When you're a musician, you're mostly tucked underneath a stage, playing the same 30 songs 8 times a week, right? So, yes, you bring your whole self to it. You try, you give it everything, and we could talk about all those things, but let's be honest about what it is and what it isn't. It's a gig.
Before you even go on,
Yeah.
when I got Memphis the musical, I think I might have said this on another podcast of mine. When I started seeing people coming in to sub for George or for John Putnam, or Mike Aarons before he left, and all of the horn players, I was like, and I see Francisco Centeno, and then I learned that he played on so many of the songs that I grew up listening to, and then I see the guy, Ira Siegel comes in, and I'm like, he was on all the Kashif records that I listened to, and then people that have played with Steely Dan, and I'm like, everyone is playing shows now. And I had to figure out, it's like, why? And then, people that wanted to sub for me, or I was trying to get to sub for me because I needed a black male person to sub for me. And I was asking people, and a lot of people were like, yeah, I'll come down. And all the people that I idolized, they were like, they wanted to sub for me. I'm like, it's fascinating to know that there are so many great musicians that were part of that studio scene that are now doing Broadway. And the level of musicianship, as you know, is so high that you have to, and I was like, man, I I had to step it up, and I stepped it up from the beginning because it was my show, but I just wanted to be able to play at the same level as these people that I grew up listening to, and all these people are playing in pits now, and they still are, and it's just fascinating how those people are doing that. But as you say, it is a gig, but most of the time,
Yeah, the people that you just mentioned are some of the best musicians I've ever played with anywhere. So I just did. I just worked with Francisco this past weekend. We played Paul Schaefer's symphony show, and we did one gig without him just before, and it wasn't. With respect, it just wasn't half the gig that it was with him. So here's something to think about. Yes, to your point, work is work, right? So, and whereas, somebody like you and me might have come in at a point when these guys ruled, and we wanted to get into that scene, right? And we'd be good at it, right? Well, I hope that that's what people thought of me as I was doing it. But so now we reverse the thing, right? So now you're solidly in the Broadway world, right? And I'm solidly in the Broadway world, and people want to sub for us. Some people who are doing shows could never do what an Ira Siegel or a Francisco Centeno do. They haven't developed that area of their playing or any number of areas of their playing. So they could not sub for them in several other circumstances. And that will be another point I would love to discuss with you. But yeah, it's a gig is a gig, and work is work. And so it is, when you have people like that, though, and you have an MD and or composer and or orchestrator and all that, like you had a Harold Wheeler, right? Harold was the orchestrator on Hairspray. Harold really understands. Lon Hoyt was the MD, Mark Shaman. These guys really understand great playing. So you can have good players who can get the job done. Then you can have great players who are going to bring something to this thing it's going to be way bigger than any of those people I just mentioned imagine. It's going to be bigger than that, and that's why they call these people, you know, that's why, you know, Harold Wheeler puts the basic information on the page and expects a Francisco or me or David Spinoza who played, or John Harrington who played, to make it, you know, more special than they could have conceived. And that's why they're smart people, you know. So anyway, it becomes really important for people to be incredibly well-rounded and to do stuff that's not Broadway, so they can bring a point of view and experience and authenticity and creativity to a show that otherwise would not be forthcoming, you know. You know what I mean, right?
I do. I'm letting you explain it because it's one of the more important things that I'd like to get across in this podcast. You know, even asking you the question, you know, what's the most important thing a drummer should know about being a success on Broadway? You basically said a lot of that already, but you can expand on that. You know, if somebody wanted to know about how to become a success on Broadway.
I think you asked a question earlier, which reveals to a lot about probably my own my own trajectory and what has worked for me, and maybe what hasn't worked for me in the long run, which is I wanted to be the best player I could. What did that mean? That meant, like, I had these heroes, right? We all have heroes. And to use those people as inspiration and to develop and play in situations that demand a lot of you, where you're the weakest link, and you just get better. You just get better. You get your ass kicked. You go on the road. You play a million different kinds of gigs. Anywhere, with anybody, all the time. Nothing is too good for you, and you keep doing it, and you go sit in like you did at Manny's, right? So I did the same thing at McKell's, which is no longer around, but McKell's was a special club that was on 97. It's now a Whole Foods, I think. It's on 97th Street in Columbus. But anyway, it went through a few different incarnations after that, but McKell's was really special, and I went and sat in. There was a jam session, like I think it was on Tuesday, and it was co-led by the great Gordon Edwards, who was the leader of the band Stuff, and you know, we know and love Stuff. I became a member of Stuff a number of years back. Stuff is still in existence. And Elliot Randall, who was a great a great guitar player, who lives in England and has been for a long time. He played Reelin' in the Years on the Steely Dan, you know, the Steely. He played solos on Fame. I think he was a great guitar player in the New York scene. So anyway, these guys hired me, right? Gordon ultimately put me in with Cornell Dupree, and I ultimately went to tour with him, did a gig at the Bottom Line years earlier. Elliot, we started a band. Ultimately, you just do different gigs, and one gig leads to another if you're good, you know, and then you keep growing, Now, you know, as I was preparing for this interview, Clayton, I did something I haven't ever done, which is to type out what I did in my life, you know, in my career, because I don't like to look back. It's not like a religion. It doesn't interest me. It bores me, and I think it's going to bore everybody else. But what I found is that the things that were show related were just like other gigs. There were gigs that came along, and I took the gigs. You know, I took the gigs because the gigs came my way. So one of the industries in New York was theater, and theater was a way to make money. And so, you know, one off-Broadway thing led to another on-Broadway thing, et cetera, et cetera. but at every point, especially when I had to sit down and create the book, right? Which is, we could talk about that too. I'd love to talk about that. But when you do that, well, you've already created parts over and over and over and over again in every situation. Because here's the fucking song. Play the song. How would you play to the song? You mean I have to tell you how to play the song? Then you suck. Let me call somebody else. I don't have to tell how to play the song. That's what we do. We're not supposed to have everybody feed us, so you hopefully, like when you got the call to do Ain't Too Proud, you had the wealth of knowledge already. You had played these songs. You were familiar with these songs. These songs were part of your DNA, right? Get me Clayton, because Clayton's going to be the shit. He's going to play the thing as it's supposed to be played. We don't have to hold him by the hand. We don't have to say this fill is inappropriate. We don't have to say, you're not playing strong enough, or you're not playing, whatever. Anyway, you get my point. You bring an authenticity to the chair. You bring your smarts, and the more capable you are, the more experience you've had, the more chairs you'll be able to fill convincingly on or on Broadway, or having nothing to do with Broadway.
You brought up something very interesting. Creating a drum book for a musical. Michael Keller talked about this on the podcast when I interviewed him, and he said that's one of the more fun parts about creating a show, is that you get to be part of the whole creative process. And as you brought up, when you're starting a show, you didn't really bring it up, but I'm going to bring it up as well. You have a pianist who's usually the musical director, and they give you a piano vocal, and you have a drum set, and they're like 5, 6, 7, 8, and you're just going to go, and you don't have a drum part written out. So as you spoke about, having played jazz and, getting presented Gene Krupa sticks, meeting Buddy Rich, playing in front of Elvin Jones, playing in bands like Stuff, and sitting in at Mikel's and Manny's Car Wash and other places, you had a wealth of knowledge that you can just basically grab from and create a drum book on your own that is appropriate for the show that you're doing. And it's hard to get that learn all those different things and getting the language of music if you just gone to college and played musicals and then want to actually create a show.
Yes.
So
everybody listening, pay attention to what you just said. It's profound.
Damian Bassman said something very similar. It's like, you have to go to the source of whatever. Like, it's not really the same kind of thing, but he was talking about if you want to play In the Heights, you have to know how to play the music that inspired In the Heights. But that if you know how to play, Latin music and funk and disco and blues and jazz and country and fusion, again, when you want to create your own show, and if you get a call to do that, then you'll have all that in order to move forward. But let me ask you a question about creating a show. Did you create the show Footloose back in, I guess, 1998 and 1999?
I did. Yeah, that was a new show, and so when it's a new show, they have only let me see, the orchestrator was a guy named Tom Snow who had co-written a couple of songs on the Footloose, not the show, but the soundtrack, and for the movie. Great guy, and but again, yeah, ultimately, well, with Footloose, you had songs that were recorded, not all of them, but a bunch of them. That was kind of a unique circumstance. though nobody told me what to play. And people were open. But, you can't take that great drum part from the actual title track. And I messed with that just a little bit. In retrospect, I probably wouldn't have, because it's perfect as it is. It's Bo Diddley, but with a twist. And I think Tris Imboden played drums on the original, and Kenny Loggins is very specific about it. That said, Kenny Loggins came to the early rehearsals, and it started with like a drum flurry. Was it in there when you did the show? It started with just some drum stuff.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, so you did this show too. So and then I started the beat, and the beat was a little different. It was very similar, but it was a little different than what was on the record, and they were fine with it. And Kenny was fine with it, and Tom was fine with it. Dean Pitchford, who had written the lyrics to every song that was in that show and every song that was in the movie and on the movie soundtrack, was the writer. And he was cool with it. So, yes, the answer is yes. I created that book. I get a little annoyed by that. The created that book, as you can probably tell, because
Why?
Because I think there's a part of us that I am of two minds about this, Clayton. There's the part of me that says that's exactly what we do every day as drummers, everywhere. So that we're suddenly congratulating ourselves and giving ourselves all this credit for playing parts that when you know the language, as you just articulated, should be intuitive, more or less, to the song that you're playing. It shouldn't be that big a deal that you're patting yourself on the back and going, look what I did, right? I created the book, as if you wrote the song. It's different, right? It's just a part. If you put the slashes and chord symbols, and you had a great guitar player come up with a part, he's creating the book too. But that's what we do as rhythm section players. I'm of that mind set, but then there's also a part of me that does understand that there are people paid large sums of money to take the creation you just made and essentially, could be transcribing it and putting it into those parts or things like it. And they're making money on it, and and there's something to be said for that. So, that's one of those circumstances. But in most circumstances, you do have orchestrators and arrangers, and they are paid, and as sidemen aren't for coming up with their parts. Anyway,
it's not really a tangent, but it's interesting to think about it the way you said it. When you have a drum part like Jeff Porcaro on Lowdown, he starts out the drum part, and it's there's two drum tracks on it. He's playing hi-hat, 16th note hi-hats on one side. And from what I understand from Larry Saltzman, he was talking about that on the podcast that he has, and how he was doing things to add things to it, but it's a signature part of the song to me. Mm-hmm. And just like the guitar part in My Girl, mm-hmm. that introduction was basically it's something that's it's a signature part, and should that guitar player who was a sideman at Motown, should he get writing credit for that? Great drum intros. Does the drummer get writing credit for that? Is it part of the song? No, but it's like you said, it's what we do as musicians, and whatever, like Steve Smith's part in "Don't Stop Believing." I mean, how unique is that? That's a big part of that song. Sure. Should he get songwriting credit for that? I don't necessarily think so, but it's like part of the song. It's just like you said, it's what we do. But at the same time, nowadays, from what I understand, if you're in the room and you say, hey, you're one of the 20 people that's supposed to get songwriting credits on a new song. It's like, you know.
It's valid. It's a valid point. And also, from what I understand, and I'm not educated in this particular area, but my understanding is that guys now, at times certainly, who are programming beats are getting writers credit.
Mm,
So there's been a change. So that's something maybe to be paying attention to, because now it's being legitimized in a different area, in a different way. I mean, if you look at, let's say, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, that is
right,
the love. I mean, if it wasn't for that,
right.
and another drummer might have just come in and, okay, boom ba ba da 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 da.
That's what I would have done.
I would have done something, but certainly not, you know. Now, along those lines, who was it who gave Anthony Jackson writing credit?
Oh yeah, For the Love of Money.
I mean, was that the
Yeah,
Isleys?
yeah. I think,
Isleys? Yeah, they gave him
no,
credit.
the OJ's.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah, OJ's.
Yeah, he got songwriting credit for that. I mean, that's a part of that song. So yeah, where's the line drawn?
Yeah.
And it's funny. Maybe we should be saying that, we're not just drummers. We make beats for Broadway musicals.
Well, there was a whole host of us at one point that sat down and made this case to 802, and I think made it very successfully.
Mm.
So when it came time, and this is the problem also, and this goes off on a tangent a little, but with each negotiation that comes up where there's an opportunity, what they're really fighting for is just to keep what you got, maybe get a little more so you can pay your medical bills. So it's negotiations with teams of lawyers, and like, yeah, but we need a higher contribution so we can have health insurance. And that kind of, that then you kind of, you go, okay, well, so let's pick our battles. And unfortunately, lower on the list is
So in other words, we're acting like pussycats. Maybe I should edit that out.
yeah, well, it's important to us. It certainly is important to us. Oh, that's funny.
I don't know. Well, yeah, it's very interesting to talk about that stuff, but to be seen in the future. We'll see
Yeah.
how that all turns out. But
Yeah.
if you're doing a new show, if you're on a workshop of a show and you're in the room, you're creating stuff. There have been times where I think about, should I just, let them come up with the part? But I just can't do that. I just sit there, and the last workshop I did, again, I created the drum part. I'm just there to help the process along and be part of the creative team.
I hear you. I did a workshop, and then it became we went to Paper Mill. It was in Paper Mill. The show was called My Very Own British Invasion. Anyway, Lon Hoyt was the MD, and he did the very thing that I think was done at Waitress, which is, I'm making you guys, I guess, orchestrators, technically. I'm making you guys orchestrators, and you're going to get a little piece of this. And he did. But it has to come from some powerful place. And if they do that, then whatever form it's going to, manifest itself in is potentially available. But it's a hard fight for a sideman.
When you were doing Footloose, that that I mean, that wasn't that wasn't your first show, but was it a longer running show than the first one that you did?
Oh yeah, it was the first show that I had that would have been considered a hit, because I think it ran. I could be wrong, but I think it ran the better part of 2 years.
Did
And
that?
and even now, a show that runs a year is like a hit.
Yes, exactly. Did that kind of establish you as one of the drummers on Broadway that, did that kind of establish you in the scene?
Yes, I think so. I mean, yes. I had done a one show in between. well, I had done a couple shows in between, but one Broadway show in between called Street Corner Symphony. Street Corner Symphony was a Motown-ish review. It only ran for a few months, but the director was the guy who was responsible for three Motowners, and Marion Caffey, I think is it. Anyway, Lon Hoyt was the MD, and he brought me in. But Miller heard me play on that, had recommended me for an off-Broadway show, which I did, called Violet, which ultimately came to Broadway. And at that point, I had sort of established my ability to do this thing and do it in sort of more sort of. There were traditional shows, but these weren't traditional shows. These were rock, pop, funky, whatever, that umbrella is. And so that, yes, that's when Footloose came along. And I'll do that.
So it ran for the better part of 2 years. How did you go about keeping the show fresh?
So that's a good question, and I'm not sure there is an actual answer for that, but I'll give you the one that I can think of, which is whenever you do a gig, you bring your whole self to the gig. If you ever feel like you're phoning something in, that's bad. That means you're not thinking, you're not focusing, and you're not keeping yourself to a standard, which is, Now, are you going to have good days and bad days? Probably. Are you going to have days where you feel better? Of course. But, I went to hear the Eagles about 6 months ago. They did the Hotel California tour. Hotel California from the 70s, right? And these guys, mostly speaking of 70s, are in their 70s. This band sounded unbelievably good. It couldn't have sounded better. It was one of the best concerts I ever saw. So how does that work? They're playing Life in the Fast Lane. There's a New Kid in Town. They're playing like all these songs that we listened to 50 years ago. So when you're talking about, like, you get a show, most shows don't see beyond a month or two. If you're lucky, they do, but most don't. But if they do, think about that shit. Think about, like, guys who are fortunate enough to be in the position to be playing the same song, a year later, 2 years later, or even 4 years later. Not, forgetting about 40 years later. I would say, so yes, you bring how do you keep it fresh? The other part of it is get out of that hole under the stage, go play other gigs. It's not only just about getting out of the hole and staying home and just, chilling. I understand the value of that, but go play other gigs, lose money, lose money, because if that's what it takes, and it probably will, but ultimately you're feeding your soul, you're feeding your brain, you're developing, and you're bringing that to the show when you come back to it. You're going to make it sound a little better because you're a little fresher and you've got a little more, and you also have an overview in a way that you might have lost just sitting there day after day after day. So that's part of the secret, I think.
Is it kind of like absence makes the heart grow fonder?
I think so. And there's also, you can appreciate what you have, and you can contribute more to what you have if you're bringing in stuff that makes you better, that fed your soul, that made you this much better as a musician, right?
So speaking of better, November 15th, year 2000. Guess it was opening night of the Rocky Horror Show.
Oh my God, Clayton.
Just a wealth of knowledge here, man. It's all up in here.
God.
Every Broadway show, it's like, no, I'm just kidding.
Oh man, you do your homework.
So tell me about the Rocky Horror Show.
Rocky Horror was the show after Footloose. It was the first show. There were some significant things about it for me. It seemed kind of fun because for obvious reasons. And then Joan Jett was in it. Dick Cavett was in it. They had all these guests in Dick Cavett's role. Dick Cavett was the narrator, and he would come and go. But then they would have like Penn and Teller and Sally Jesse Raphael and what's his name? The great. They had a bunch of great comedians. Anyway, but they had great singers in that show. Sebastian Bach came in at one point to do it. So it was rock and rollish from that era. Again, they said, do what you want to do with this. So, it was one of the first shows I remember thinking, and I know I've heard you speak about the Click before, and I'd like to talk about that for a second, but I had an orientation to the Click, and I found that when there's so many people who weigh in on how fast or how slow something is, and this felt faster, and everybody has their own, depending on how tired they are and how much they ate and whatever, what kind of mood they're in, everybody has a different clock. I feel like in a Broadway circumstance, it's a problem solver. So I asked the MD at Rocky Horror if I could, me and Irio O'Farrell, the bass player, if we could listen to a Click on these songs, if I could. So he was like, sure. So I would activate the Click, and I was happier with it. On Footloose, there wasn't one. And in fact, when I asked for it for the recording sessions, I got absolutely not. I was like, you don't want to do this to a Click? By the way, the music was done to a Click, that we're playing, on those original songs. No, it's not what we do. So, okay. But how did we get to that? Oh, Rocky Horror. So, that ran until 9/11. And 9/11 closed any shows that were operating that weren't wildly successful at the time. If you were doing okay, it wasn't going to make it. It was a microcosm in terms of its longevity of what we experienced with COVID and obviously severe in its own way, but once it happened, then it was just a question of recovering, people going back, and it took them a while, and that was that. But it was a good experience.
You later went on, later in 2002, to be the drummer for a new show called Hairspray. How did you go about getting that show?
Well, so the MD and the contractor wanted me there. The MD I had worked with already, and yourself that oftentimes if an MD is comfortable with you, they want you there the next time, and that's one way. So in this case, Lon Hoyt was the MD, and he Mark Shaman I did not know, and he wasn't weighing in. It was John Miller's show, and he did want me there. I had worked with the choreographer on Rocky Horror, Jerry Mitchell, but Jerry was working with somebody else at the time, so that wasn't necessarily the ticket. I think it was Lon and John at the time. That's how I got involved with that, and that was a good experience. It ran for I think 6.5 years, This is my longest show. It was wildly successful early on, and ultimately I did the movie. Not the original. There was an original movie that this show was based on, and then there was a movie that was based on the show, and I did that. And then I did Hairspray live a number of years ago, and so it was kind of the gift that kept giving. And I was that again. Mark had some demos. He never played them for me, and he said, "Do your thing." And so I drew from, it was 60s based, but there was also stuff that was 70s ish. And so, yeah, that's how that worked. It was, we went to Seattle. There was a good band there, and then we're there for 6 weeks and then brought it here.
So, since it was such a successful show, I'm sure you probably had a lot of people reaching out to you to try to sub for you.
Yeah.
What were the criteria that you used in order to make sure that the person that you're going to bring in was qualified to be a sub for you at Hairspray?
It's a really good question. And a question that I'm sure you've had to answer yourself. What could work here? For any show, you have to. I mean, you have to get somebody who can follow a conductor, right? You have to, even if it's on click, which Hairspray was, let's say, maybe 70% on click or something, maybe a little more, but. Yeah, so you don't necessarily have to watch them all, but then there are times the click disappears. There places you have to get somebody who can watch a conductor. I think, right now, that eliminates 98% of the drummers that I know. I'm sorry, Listen, man, it's when you recommend somebody. It's your reputation that is so somebody has to know how to follow. Then you have to have a sense that this person stylistically can pull off what it is that needs to be pulled off, and that their vibe is not going to be troubling to anybody. They're friendly enough and they're prompt. There's no issue there. Now you got other factors: geography, availability. Could they help you in a pinch? So I do things where I would use a smaller number of subs and give them a lot more work, rather than a large number of subs and give them very little work, because there'd be times that I might need help, and they were perfectly happy to help because it was an account for them, right? Now the other thing is, how are they going to prepare this show? The sub job on Broadway is the hardest. Subbing on a drum chair on Broadway is the hardest job that I've ever done in music. Period. End of story. And I've only subbed on, I think, 3 different shows in my life. It was all the hardest thing. So, what do you look for there? There's one guy that I used a lot who would karaoke, more or less. He would cop the fills, he'd cop the grooves, he'd study that stuff, and he'd come in and he'd play everything sort of verbatim. And he did a good job of it. So nobody had a problem with it, And even then, it's not going to sound like you. I don't know if that's good or bad, but, it's a hard job, right? A drummer defines every single beat of music for everybody, everywhere, on top of the stage and underneath. So even if you're playing to the click, even if I came in and sub for you on Ain't Too Proud, I could cop everything that you play, and it won't sound like you. He doesn't play as loud in that spot that you did. shit, I watched him so many times and I listened to and I didn't get that. No, he doesn't play that loud. You're playing too loud in that spot. Oh, he plays louder in that spot. What are you doing? Dynamics are the hardest thing to reproduce, because they just are. You hear them one way when you're preparing and you think, but now the other thing is the balance within the kit. I had a guy come in to Beautiful and subbed, and he you know how you distribute things dynamically within your hands and your feet, and this is the mix of the kit. This was one situation where the guy said, the MD said, it just doesn't sound, I mean, the bass drum is super loud and whatever, not unmusical, just too different, Hairspray had some challenging things. I never played something to make it challenging for challenging's sake, ever. I tried to make it stylistically appropriate, and I always had the sub in mind too. I tried not to go for things that were too complicated, but there was some demanding stuff in that show. Like Francisco played that show, and what he played was so complicated, but that's how his brain works, It doesn't sound complicated when he plays it, but guys would come in and just pare it down, and the MD was fine with that. You just got the meat of it. With my thing, they had to do a little, some of those faster fills were part of the music, and they had to get that. So anyway, those were among the considerations, right? There's a lot of them.
Hairspray, wildly successful, runs until 2009. You get another show, if I'm not mistaken, Everyday Rapture.
Yeah, man, you've done your homework. It took me a while to remember the order of things. So, but in that period of time, things had happened. I was on the road on and off during Hairspray. I got Art Garfunkel's gig, and we're going out and doing gigs with him, and then a singer, Linda Eder, and she was fine singer, more theatrical based. Anyway, both of these artists were touring, and then those gigs and Hairspray went away. Michael Keller had offered me the production of West Side Story that was happening at that time, and like an idiot, I turned it down because Art and Linda had a bunch of gigs, and I was sort of happy to be emancipated, but really working, doing road gigs. Then the road gigs went away, so there was a good period of time there where I wasn't doing a show. I mean, it was maybe the better part of a year, and it had been the first time in a while that was the case, and so I think I subbed. I may have my chronology wrong, but I think I subbed for Warren Oates. He had the Frank Sinatra show, "Come Fly Away" or something like that. I can't remember. Anyway, but yes, Everyday Rapture was a limited run on Broadway, maybe 6 weeks or something like that, and yeah, that was the next thing. It didn't run a long time, but it wasn't supposed to.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, it was a limited run. Yeah.
And you got a call to do a show about airplane pilots called Catch Me If You Can.
Yes.
It's a great movie from what I remember. I didn't see the show. Did you like the show?
Yeah, I liked it a lot. I'm debating whether I tell you this story from from Everyday Rapture before we go on. It's a pretty funny story, so I'm going to tell you, but you can get rid of it if you don't like it. But anyway, there was if you've ever had the experience of driving, and the horrible experience where you're driving, it's very late and you're very, very tired and you nod out a little, and then you wake up and you go, oh my God, I can't believe that just happened. In Everyday Rapture, the star of the show had a lot of dialogue, and they decided to give us to play under her dialogue something super, super, super simple to play, like boom, 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 and she'd go into a thing, and it would, she was extremely interesting and a great singer. And what was going on underneath her was sort of a, just underscore that was the simplest and involved no brain power at all. And I remember at one point, it might have been just drums and bass, long time, boom, boom, boom. And Clayton, I started to go like this. And I was like, you can drive when you're nodding out. I was playing the drums. And anyway, I couldn't freaking believe that what had happened. It's like a split second, and then you go, okay, I got to stay in the lane. Catch Me did not run long. It wasn't the success everybody expected it should have been, because everybody was involved in Hairspray. The actor won best, the Tony for best male in the musical, and almost everybody was the same, but there was one person that wasn't, and that was the writer. And somehow the story was deemed less compelling. There were people involved who had an idea of what it should be, and that was going to be different than the movie, which, you can't argue with the movie. The movie was masterful. There was great music to play in this, and I loved playing it. Band was on stage. It was big bandy. There were things that were swing. There were things that New Orleans. There were, rock things. It was a great all around thing, but it went away after about 4 months.
There are times where you're doing a show and they have a company meeting at 7:15 or 7:30, and you're like, oh my God, the show's going to close. Did you know that the show was going to close when they had that company meeting? Or was it a surprise?
No, it was a surprise. I think when the surprise happened, it wasn't like that. It was opening night. What? And we were at the opening night party.
Oh, no.
Yeah, the reviews were, especially the Times review was not kind. And I remember coming outside at the party when it was time to leave and seeing two significant people on the creative team crying, because it had taken them 10 years. There was a big story behind it. And in fact, I got to know the guy that was the lead in real life, the interesting fella. And Spielberg had a couple of stories about that show. It was a major thing, so the expectations were high. And then once that review came out, I think there was this sense that, they didn't trash it, but they weren't kind, and there was this sense that they weren't necessarily gonna throw money at it to see if it caught on in a way that they just kind of felt like it now had a limited life, and it was a slap in the face. So that's what happens. That's, if they could figure it out, they would have figured it out, right?
Tell me about your first time playing on the Tony Awards.
Actually, I've only done the actual ceremony once, and I can't remember what it was. Either Hairspray or Catch Me, but I can't remember which one. I'm pretty sure it was one of those two. But I have done the recordings before, and and you probably have too, right? Where you yeah. So oftentimes they'll have a guy who plays a drummer who's there in the orchestra, in the Tony's orchestra, but they'll often bring in a drummer who is familiar with the show, so the MD and the drummer can come in. Maybe there are others, but maybe not, and do the recording session. And it's not hard because you've been doing it, and you do one song, I think, typically, and that's that. And you've done it too, right?
Yes, I've been fortunate to play on stage at the Tony Awards twice, and it was a fantastic experience. I'll never forget it. And even the last time I was, I had my cell phone out and just recording everything because it's like I don't know when else will happen again.
Yeah.
But nowadays, at least the last time with Ain't Too Proud, the Tony Orchestra is in a separate studio,
Yeah.
and for the music that they play before or after a specific musical gets presented,
Hmm.
the orchestra records that in the studio where the Tony Orchestra is going to be playing. So we played like I forgot what they call it, the teaser music before and after, and it was just so much fun to go in there and do that. And that's another thing about and kind of connecting the things that you talked about earlier as far as being a studio musician, having the ability to go in and perform at a moment's notice at a high level, knowing that that recording is going to be out there permanently, because whatever you record, it's going to be on the TV show, and people nowadays can just go to YouTube and see that. So it's an interesting, and I think it's a necessary skill to have, to be able to go in and use all the experience that you had in the past towards those kind of recordings. And even when you like, I want you to explain as far as how cast recordings are made. I'm sure you've made many. What is your experience in doing cast recordings, and how is that different from doing a jingle from back in the day?
Oh yeah. Well, jingles are short. Um, they come and they were, you might do a 15-second, 30-second, 60-second, 90-second, whatever. But it's one session, you're done, and it usually doesn't, was usually an hour. With a cast recording, as you well know, um, you might have a couple days in the studio. You know, um, and some have been more pleasant experiences than others, and it kind of depends on um, things that are beyond our pay grade. How much do they care? And you know, it used to be that they would make you play with the singers live. I mean, the Footloose thing, we'd be doing take after take after take because the singers, might have had an issue, and we were playing it live. This was the same, record where they refused to do a click. And that, I think it was really more common for musicians and singers to be playing cast albums live, which was in and of itself an enormous pain in the butt. But that I think is mostly different now, as people have come to know that these, for isolation purposes, for sanity purposes, you concentrate on music, and then you do vocals afterward. Um, so, in a general sense, they're usually pretty pleasant. The music is already, they might be tweaking things arrangement wise. You get a decent level, your basic parts, and you go in and do them. But to your point about TV, it's very important. Yes. And there was something I was going to say about this. One time when we did Letterman, that was with Catch Me. And, they were going to do a thing on Letterman. And I knew the guys in the band and have worked with them before and after. And I had to play on Anton's kit at the time to do it. It was just, the band was going to be on the platforms that they were. And then Anton said, "You know what? Play these bumpers going into the show, and coming out, or something like that." He was like, So to your point, Paul was conducting, and he'd play the bumpers,
For
at not
Letterman?
the show. Letterman, yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
Yes. I did Saturday Night Live too, once subbing for Sean. That was a trip.
Sean Pelton, for those people that don't know.
Yeah, and that's another story that's fun.
Well, let me ask you. I haven't really. I've never met Sean. Has he done any Broadway?
No, and he doesn't. He doesn't. Sean, I mean, first of all, the gig, the Saturday Night Live gig, which he sounds great on, and he's a great drummer. Uh, we've talked about it. I think he was curious about it, but I've also talked to Steve Gadd about it.
Yeah. Okay. Tell me the truth about what Steve Gadd says about Broadway, because I've heard so many stories.
There was one night. I mean, I consider Steve a friend, and I really like him, and I feel privileged to say that. But there was one night when a bunch of us, when I say a bunch of us, I think maybe me and Odes and Marchika had gone down to hear him with Michelle Petrucciani, and he knew that a number of us were there, and at the time we all had shows and whatever. And I don't think Tommy Igoe was there that night, but Steve, I know I had a specific conversation with him in the dressing room, but other guys had talked to him as well. And he was like, yeah, the Broadway thing, it's. I said, Steve, why are you even asking? He said, well, I've never done it. And he considered it, a challenge. And then at one point he asked me how much it paid. And I don't remember the exact exchange, the exact wording, but I think he was shocked. But he masked it well. Steve is one of the best paid, drummers who ever walked the planet.
Right. Right.
So,
Yep.
well, so, and we know that a Broadway gig is a good gig, but it's not a great gig unless you're there a lot. Right? I mean, otherwise it's a gig. It's not a bad gig, on a per time basis. So, and he was basically asking what scale was for a show, and I was, and then I talked about doubles or something like that. But
He probably said you need like to double and double that. Then I might consider it.
Yeah, no, I think like a number of things, Steve, could do anything he wants, and he has to figure out, how he's going to allocate his time, and that's Broadway, But Larry Saltzman, before, I think I might have told you this once, but Larry, and he doesn't like that I tell this story, but it's just it's too excellent not to tell. There was a point when Larry was offered Hairspray, not once but twice, and Larry was one of those guys with the studio business was still kind to him because though it had pared down most other instruments as sidemen, people still needed guitar players to come in, occasionally saxophone players, and of course singers. But the guys were doing all the rest of this stuff mostly on their own. So anyway, Larry was busy. And he said to me, does anybody ever do these shows that doesn't actually need to do them? I thought about it for a second. The answer I gave him was no. I don't think anybody actually does, which is probably why we never saw Steve Gadd sitting in a pit.
That's interesting.
But ultimately, I mean, with regard to Sean Pelton, Sean is busy. He's got another area of music between the show and other things that he does that he doesn't have to delve into this particular area. There are some people that have chosen this particular area. I mean, look, how many TV gigs are there in New York? At any given time, there might be 2 or 3.
Right, it's not very many.
Only one that's really sustained. Although Letterman was around for a good long time, but on Letterman you had exactly 2 drummers in like 30 years.
Right.
On Saturday Night Live, I mean, they had a bunch of drummers, but Sean has been the drummer for a very, very long time. So your TV options are kind of, limited. So now you have, and since studio work had diminished as much as it has, and people are doing stuff in their homes, you know, that's one of the reasons why Broadway has been pursued as much as it has.
There are 41 shows that could be running at any time if all of the theaters have shows in them. And there's generally around 19 to 20 musicals. So that's 20 drummers, and there's hundreds, probably not thousands of people that want to get on a Broadway show. So it's a highly coveted position. And
Yes.
then, then like you said, there's 2 or 3 TV shows in New York City. It's like it's slim pickings out here now, and you have to find another way to make money as a musician. But I understand why people want to do what we have done in the past, and that's why I'm doing this podcast to tell people or show people different ways of getting shows. There are multiple ways of doing it, but there are generally there are common threads between all the musicians that have done shows that have been successful over a long period of time. And one of those is to be able to play multiple types of music and take all that knowledge and distill it in the form of a Broadway show. And then when you get to do a Broadway show, it gets distilled and then distilled again.
Yeah.
And,
No,
and you're like, wait, what's this?
yes, that's right. And it's important to recognize that. See, that's the thing that I think most guys don't know. Again, we go back, right? But Warren Oates calls it almost music, right? He's calling it almost. And the reason why, I mean, he's one of the wittiest guys I know. But one of the reasons why he calls it almost music is exactly what you just said. So let's say the composer comes up with a great idea, and here's what it is. Well, automatically now, if it's in a show setting, you might not be playing it at an authentic volume level. If you were playing it in a club or in a concert or whatever, or a recording session, you'd be playing it. Now you've shrunken that down. Is it important to know that? I think it is. Yes. I think it's important to know that, because now you're going to, you want to bring all the intensity that you can and all the intent, but you have to pare down the volume. So you should be aware of that. If you're not aware of that and you think that's the go-to thing, then you might play like a pussycat.
That's going to be the theme of this podcast. Don't play like a pussycat.
Yeah, so intensity, and then now you have dialogue. Oh, well, we want underscoring. Okay, so now you're shrinking this down to something so the person can be heard speaking. And then you have dancers. Now they're gonna have you play on the and of two in a way that completely fucks up the groove. Because people are looking on the stage and they're seeing a kick or whatever, and that's your gig. But you should know, right, that's kind of weird. They injected it in for that reason. Another thing is, when I'm playing a gig, and as I said, I embrace the click, and I like to use it for reference, and sometimes I'll even use it for the first few bars of its song, so I can, and then I like to turn it off and play. And then if you listen to the recording and you run the click, there are very few guys who are going to stay with it from beginning to end. But it's hopefully it will have a certain proximity. But that's because you're doing a gig. And it's only about you guys on the stage, right? So in a show, you're rounding off things, to here's the tempo. We're going to pick this tempo. The song moved a little in different places, and I've heard you point out that it feels much better, and I don't disagree with you. But in a circumstance like that, it becomes much harder for a sub to try and reproduce those things, because it becomes family secrets. Like, you guys play it all the time. So this is going to move faster. This is going to move slower. You don't even think about it. A guy coming in is like, what the fuck is happening here? Why is this faster? Why is this? Well, that's just how it developed. And so, it becomes much harder for that sub. So yeah, distilled down. Yeah, that's the nature of that beast.
Bonnie and Clyde, Jesus Christ Superstar, Jekyll and Hyde, Soul Doctor, then Beautiful, the Carole King musical. Another smash hit.
Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah.
That ran for
5 years.
5 years.
5 years. Yeah.
That
Very
is a very long time for a musical. Uh, I'm sure you had a chance to meet and hang out with Carole King.
She came, and I did know, not her. We actually played with her, the show. We did one of those early morning shows where you're outside and you're playing and it's winter and you feel like your hands are going to break. I actually played with gloves on, like winter gloves. But anyway, she played with us, and yes, she came, and um, that was one of those experiences, like Hairspray. I didn't think Hairspray was going to run. I didn't think Beautiful was going to run. I thought that Hairspray was like, okay, so let's get this straight. Like, the lead is a really, really heavy girl with a squeaky-ish voice, and the other lead is a guy who, for no particular reason, is wearing a dress the whole show, and he talks like this, and that's gonna somehow capture the hearts and minds of America, right? No, I don't think so. And then, of course, it did. And Beautiful, I thought, was gonna appeal primarily to, you know, suburban, New York women. And I thought it was it's a good story and beautiful songs, but I just thought that the demographic wasn't what it turned out to be. You never know. We didn't win either. The year,
Really?
yeah, we didn't win for best musical. We won best. We won a few best somethings, including best actress. But there was another show that took it, that was kind of a sleeper of a show, and it gave it a little more of a life. And I think that there are lots of thoughts about that, but whatever. It had already become successful and made its money back within a year, which most shows don't do. And it was doing well. One point I wanted to make, just from a drum standpoint, about Beautiful. Carole King songs, beautiful, beautiful songs. The drums, I tried to make the drum parts as musical and sparse, and the fills were nothing complicated. And I tried to make it in the character of the music. I think we all try and do that, right? Um, and I was conscious that when subs, I was conscious about subs, always was conscious about subs, that the position of the monitor, the position of the music stands, the drums, the positioning of the cymbals, even, and that when guys came in to learn the show, it was going to be a basic show. If I had done a little more with one thing or another, not when they were there, and it wasn't the expectation. I think about the subs a lot when I'm developing a drum part, because I want it to be sub friendly. I think that's very important, and I know that there are guys who aren't necessarily as concerned about that, and it can be very difficult for their subs. And I think maybe even there are some guys who know that, and I don't applaud that. I think that if your setup becomes and your parts become unnecessarily complicated, or electronics become unnecessarily complicated, I think you're doing a big disservice to the show and to the guys that you have coming in that are supposed to be, holding up your contribution while you're not there. That's my own thought. Here's what I've found that look, if sound designers could have it their own way, sometimes I know one in particular, and he works a lot, and I like him very much, and he's good. But he would much prefer everything to be on Roland V drums, because what those guys really want is the ability to control and isolate and have everything sort of squashed and whatever. So the whole idea of, yeah, we need this snare drum here, but then we need this snare drum there. By the time they're done, your various snare drums are going to be barely discernible, maybe sometimes not at all discernible. The fact that you chose this vintage kit because it was of that vintage period, and you and I have talked about this, that what the guys, the sound designers want, and the guys who are mixing and guys, et cetera, they don't want your bass drum to ring a long period of time. They don't want your snare drum to ring. They don't want the toms to ring too long. And by the time they're done compressing it and muffling it and putting it through the house, which is going to be underneath the singers and mixed in with the band, you're not going to fucking know the difference between snare drum A and snare drum B, unless it's like, okay, this is where I have this tiny little thing and it's tuned up, high as a kite, and blah 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 blah.
Yeah, or a marching snare drum. If it's
Right.
marching, and yeah.
Perhaps, right? Yeah, but for the most part, go with more simple and understand what the final product is going to be, not how much you might be impressing other drummers, or what it would be if it was your record and your gig, but what the whole picture is and what it's ultimately going to sound like out there.
No.
I subbed on Next to Normal and then ultimately took over the chair. Damian Bassman had originated that part, and a bunch of the songs, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, were songs that Tom Kitt, who had a band, and Damian was in that band, and they used to play those songs. And Damian is a terrific percussionist, so he had orchestra bells sort of above the hi-hat, and there were vibes right behind me, and then one timpani over that way. And there were some really tricky things. It took me a good 2 solid months of practicing because it had been a long time since I had played mallets, and I was never a great mallet player. I mean, I did my scales and whatever, and I could play things in college, but that was when it ended, so anything else was just hit a bell here, hit a bell there, that kind of thing. This was like, Damien had worked out something where it was like, a cymbal part mixed in with orchestra bells, and you had ding, ding, ding. It was really kind of tricky. And he loved it, and he's good at that. I don't think it was sub-friendly, and the vibes part wasn't 4 mallets, it was 2 mallets, but there were some, a bunch of arpeggios and stuff like that. So that was hard to do, and that was a high-British book. That there are times when electronics might be fully warranted, where you really need another sound of a kit altogether. And I think Tommy Igoe had an electronic kit and a regular acoustic kit, and he did that for reasons because the sounds were actually very, very different. And he would go over to that kit and play the electronics at one point, and that made sense. Or if you need sounds that are really super processed and you don't want to sort of leave it to them to figure out how to do that, that's another justification. Or, sound effects or whatever. So, yeah, I would say, but do it judiciously and when necessary, and make it easy for subs and yourself to dial that up when needed, and and move through it. Don't make it complicated. I'll tell you a very quick story. When I was subbing for Sean on Saturday Night Live, he had to trigger a sequencer as the beginning of, it was like, live from New York. It's Saturday night. And Sean would hit a pedal next to his hi-hat, and it would start a sequencer, and you'd play along with it, right? You know, there would be clicks, and I can't remember the specifics, but anyway, it's kind of an archaic little pedal setup that he had. He could work it fine. He never had a hitch. So there were two rehearsals or so. One included the dress rehearsal, which had an audience, and then there was a show. And live from New York is Saturday night. Hit the thing, everything's fine. Rehearsal 1. In the dress rehearsal, same thing. Hit the pedal, everything's fine. The show, as Ashton Kutcher is the guest, and he's doing this monologue in his underwear, and he's like, I don't know what's wrong with me. Anyway, it's really funny. And live from New York, it's Saturday night, and I hit the pedal, and nothing happened. And I hit the pedal again, and nothing happened. And then I hit it again, and it triggered. Now, the period of time felt like an eternity, and certainly everybody knew that the music hadn't started yet, and it wasn't an eternity, but it was long enough, you know. So I passed this along to anybody who might be using, electronics, to be very conscious of the effectiveness and the ease with which that stuff is workable, you know.
I often ask this to many of my guests. What are some things drummers should never do in a Broadway pit?
When they're actually playing the show, or when they're watching it?
When they're playing the show.
Yeah. What should they never do? Well, you know, you got to keep your focus. So if it's early on, and and you got a big break, I mean, be careful if you're going to, divert to reading something you're reading or something you're looking at with your phone or whatever. Be alert. The obvious things, like any gig, you know, be aware of everything that you've come to know when you were preparing, and stay focused, and don't talk. I mean, don't start conversations with people. You don't know if you're going to be razzing somebody who needs to, if you're right next to somebody, and you just stay focused. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. What should a sub drummer on a Broadway show never do?
Yeah. So I was thinking, that's what when I was thinking of subs, when I was thinking of, because they just don't know, and they can't, right? Generally, what the dynamic is at different points. I think that a sub drummer, when he comes in, he should be there early, seated, ready to rock, and not be playing. If he's going to be playing, maybe on a pad, if the drummer has a pad there, but don't do a lot of playing, because it annoys people, I noticed that there's certain subs that come in sometimes. I mean, I'm not there when sub drummers come, but there's certain subs that come in on other instruments, and they're playing a lot before the show. I mean, if they have to tune and they got to do a little whatever, cool. But if it goes on for a while, it can be annoying, and people, become annoyed. They want to go there to sit down and get their thing together, and then do the thing. Also, make sure that chances are, if they're avions and they're personalized and people have their own mix, that's great. But if you change something, change it back. Change a setting, change an angle of, the kit, and don't leave stuff there. If you brought a drink in or whatever, take it.
Sandwich wrappers and
yeah.
throwing the garbage in the corner and
yeah. And I think also this goes back to the subs and choosing what they might do when they're playing. Be very, very, very careful what you change. Um, that there, as you have articulated, there are times during a rehearsal or previews or maybe beyond where you play something and you might even work it into a fill. Let's say it's a dance accent or something that goes along with something they're singing. Uh, if all you're doing as a sub is isolating the music and saying, oh, well, when that fill comes, I'll play in the spirit of that fill, but it's going to be a different fill. You're making a decision that might actually affect something on the stage. Be careful about that. If there's a groove, be careful about injecting something into that groove or adding ghost notes where there aren't or taking ghost notes away where there are. Just be careful about that because all that stuff is for better or for worse, very familiar to everybody. You don't have to karaoke it, you don't have to, but there's a process by which you figure out where you can and can't. And it's better to start more, not necessarily karaokeing, but really, really, really paying homage to the guy that you've learned the show from.
You've done several shows over the many decades. Do you watch your own show from the audience?
Mostly I don't, and the reason for that is because if you do that, the experience we have in the pit is very focused, and you're hearing every little thing that everybody else does, and what especially what you want to hear. You've dialed your mix, your tuning, and you know what you do, and you know what you've brought to that, and you know that when you play this little figure on the hi-hat, it's that you know all these little things, and you go out in the audience and you listen, and you can't hear like 65% of it. It's heartbreaking, you know. It's so. Have I done it? I have done it, but in a general sense, we're dealing with a medium where the vocals and the talking and all of that takes such precedent over the music that the mix that you don't subject yourself to, you don't have to hear, like what you might hear on a cast album. A cast album, which is like, where they mix the vocals louder than any other area of music ever. I don't know whose idea this was, but like the band is puny often, and the vocals are so freaking loud that when you want to hear something in the band, you have to turn it up, and your ears are practically bleeding from the vocals. They don't do this in opera, opera is a vocal-based medium, but for some reason you can hear the orchestra better. The mix is higher. So, when you're in the pit, I prefer just sort of to stay there and hear this vocal and pretend it's a gig, right?
Do you go back and ever listen to any cast albums that you've done?
No.
No?
I don't, because again, it's the same experience. I mean, if I had to learn a song, there was one time I was doing this gig at 54 Below for a then not well-known Ben Platt, who became the guy, and he decided to do, and you'll know this, I Can't Stand Still from Footloose. You probably don't remember
I
this.
forgot it. Yeah, it's like I sketched that out of my brain.
Yeah, well, you probably blocked it out of your memory for self-preservation. It's not a bad song. It's not a bad song, but it was kind of kitschy, and Ben wanted to do it, and I had no idea what I had done, and I had to listen to that. But other than a reference, generally listening to cast albums because of how they're mixed, not because of not because of the songs that were written or anything, but the ultimate mix that people seem to prefer, it winds up being an uncomfortable experience. I'm more or less, I can tell you that I'm good with my playing on these records. I'm good with it. And sometimes I'd be fine, you know, for somebody to say, well, how does Clint de Ganon play? Let's listen to what he did on, you know, on Bonnie and Clyde's, you know. So it didn't run long. A lot of fun to play. I'd be fine with it, but you know, as an experience of myself, and no, not so much.
All right. Well, it's interesting. You brought something up. I'm just going to ask you if
Yeah.
there is one record that exemplifies, didn't even say that right. If there's one record that exemplifies Clint de Ganon, and you'd say, you know what, you need to listen to this, would that be the record behind you or the
No,
record to you to the side, the West Side Story one, which we'll get
well,
into in a minute?
yeah, West Side Story, I'm proud of, and I'd be fine for you to listen to that. But would I say that was stylistically sort of coming from my heart? No, I mean obviously, uh, a clear, an obvious example of a show of music that I did not originate. Although I was able to I was able to play on a couple of songs, stuff that I wanted to play, and if you know that show, I can explain what those things were. But uh, you know, recently, if you, I don't know if you are friends with Peter Erskine, but he was doing a thing on Facebook, maybe Instagram too, I'm not sure, of infinity drum. He would call it infinity drummers, and he would just take a drummer and sometimes you would know the guy, of course, and then other times it might be somebody that you weren't as familiar with. And he did one for me, which was incredibly flattering. It was after the West Side Story, and he took a record that I'd played on like 20 years ago, was on a label called DMP, where I did a few records, and this was Warren Bernhardt, the great piano player Warren Bernhardt. Chuck Loeb had produced it, and I can't remember the name of the song, but anyway, I went back and listened to it because he had singled it out. It was very, very nice of him, and I liked it. I was happy with it. That doesn't always happen. So then there's also there have been a couple of records that I played on with Hiram Bullock that I liked a bunch of tracks that were on that. Uh, if you took records that I've played on, I could probably pick a song versus the whole record. You know, that I'd say, oh yeah, listen to this. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you have the same experience where sometimes you listen to something and you say, okay, that was pretty good, and that's usually the best it's going to get for me. Okay, that was pretty good. I'm not uncomfortable with it. Versus like something, well, if I could have done that again, I would. You know, that kind of thing.
So there's a poster of West Side Story behind you.
Yeah.
You did the movie and the soundtrack.
Yes, the soundtrack was the thing that was a very special experience. And the movie was a kind of a fluky thing where we need a band to be simulating, in my case, what I had played in the recording studio. In the actual movie, there's a scene in the gym where the Jets and the Sharks are there, and it's a dance at the gym, and there's so there was a band there, and I was one of the musicians that was in that, and we did get credit on the movie in the role, but unfortunately for the recording sessions, we did not get credit, as most musicians don't. I had wished that they had put at least the soloists, in that, because it was one of the most amazing experiences of my career. I had never played West Side Story before, and I had worked with the music producer before and the contractor, and they said, "Would you like to do this?" And it took me a minute to say yes, because I did not want to put myself in a position of I knew the music was hard, and it was the New York Philharmonic ultimately, and Gustavo Dudamel, and rock star conductor. But these guys are they've played West Side Story. There's a drummer who has played West Side Story with them a bunch, and I wasn't that guy. But ultimately it worked out well. They did it in 3 parts. First part was playing the whole score. I call it the world's most expensive demo. They did the whole score with some ringers and some members of the Phil and some members of the Met, and a great conductor, a composer who ultimately got arrangement credit on West Side Story, named David Newman. And then they shot the movie, so the actors could sing to this world's most expensive demo and dance to it and whatever. And then we did the music again, this time with the Phil proper and Dudamel conducting. And COVID shut us down. There were about 3 sessions left. And so there's a drummer on the West Coast who played prologue and a couple of incidental things. But I had done the rest of it here.
I need to go see that movie. I hear it's really good.
It's good, and the sound is good. And Spielberg came to the drum booth once. He was walking around with his handheld. He apparently does that on his movies. But we thought he might be getting footage for the making of West Side Story. That was what we were told. And there's a song in there called "Cool," and "Cool" features the drums, and there are drum breaks. And so at that point, he came to the drum booth, and you know, I'm trying to concentrate on playing, and there's Spielberg outside of the plexi like this, and he opens the door for the next take and comes up to me, and he's standing right here with his handheld while I'm going da 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 da, and Spielberg's there, and I could barely keep it together, Clayton. It was, I mean, it was, he's a lovely guy. It was very flattering, but I was kind of freaked,
There are times where I've done gigs or shows, and people that I've looked up to are watching me play, and for a few minutes there, it makes me feel a certain way. I get intimidated, but then I realize that, I'm on the gig and it's my gig. Do you get rattled in situations like that, or other times where there are people that you've grown up listening to? Say, for instance, if Buddy Rich was still alive,
yeah,
and he came to see you play, would you be like, "Oh man, Buddy Rich is here," and would you change anything, or you, how do you approach situations like that?
I have become conscious of at times where there are musicians that I love who are listening. Listen, man, one time I was playing with Gordon Edwards and Stuff, and I mean, I can give you a few of these examples, but this one, and Gad is in the audience, and Purdy's in the audience. I'm done. There was another time when it was a tribute. Cornell Dupree had passed, and it was at B.B. King's, and Steve Jordan had put this whole thing together, and Steve said to Gordon, "Would you like, Chris and Steve to be playing?" Cornell was in the band, and Gordon said, "No, this is my band now," and I was the drummer, so I got up to play with Stuff, Gordon Edwards and Stuff, after Steve and Chris had played together in Chris's band. He brought up Steve to play with him as a guest. Gad was standing on the side the whole time when I was playing, and there were 2 other drum sets on the stage. Fortunately, I didn't know he was there. I didn't know he was standing there on the stage. But I guess the answer to your question is, it's very difficult during those times to really, tune out, heroes and not be aware that they're listening to you, which of course is the worst thing you can possibly do, but it's human.
If you were going to advise somebody on what you need to know, or like how to become a success as a Broadway musician, like what would you tell somebody that's graduated from college and I'm you know what I'm about to get out of Berkeley or Juilliard or whatever you're going to conservatory. Was it? That's not North Texas State anymore. It's University of North Texas. These drummers that come out of there, man, I'm moving to New York.
Yeah.
What would you say to
Well,
them?
what I'm gonna say is not necessarily. It's just the way I've approached it, but I'm not advocating it for per se. But I really, really, really think that when you set your eye on money, on a job that's going to make money, it doesn't generally work well. I mean, there's nothing wrong with, no, prepare yourself in every possible way you can for every possible situation, but be the best drummer you can be the best musician you can be, and learn a million different kinds of styles and do a million different kinds of gigs. And sure, if you can get into sub, or you might be able to get a tour, or you play some show. Like I played one of the first shows, if not the first show I ever played, was Godspell in Fishkill, New York. I mean, it probably paid like $74 a show. But take those things, like I mean, look, when you think about it, you have to. And I watched Michael Keller talk about this on your podcast. You got to cut your teeth. He was talking about like subbing for people or taking a tour. Yeah, I mean, don't start. If you want to be a great lawyer, or you want to be a great advertising man, or you want to be a great doctor, you don't say, listen, I know you're strategizing on how you're going to fight, this thing if you're an attorney, or how you're going to perform brain surgery. Can I just go and watch you? No, you know what? Take lessons, maybe. Study with people. Go to shows, take off Broadway gigs, get in any conductible situation you possibly can so you can figure that out. Make sure you play well with a click. Listen to as many different kinds of styles as you can. And yeah, if you want, listen to some cast records or whatever, but don't make that the goal. Don't make it the goal. Be the best drummer you can be so that people are interested in, there's some great drummers doing Broadway shows now. There's some really great drummers. They're great at other things. They're not, people want them because they're great drummers, not because they're great show drummers. Right? So my advice is to be as well-rounded and as great a musician as you can possibly become. You'll be more attractive to any gig, including shows. Does that make sense?
Amen.
There's one story I'll tell you very quickly that I was doing a rehearsal with John Miller's band, and I got a phone call at 10:04 in the afternoon from Will Lee, who said, "Can you come to Radio City right now and play Sir Duke with Stevie Wonder?" And I was like, "What?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said to the guys, "You understand, right?" They said, "Yes, we understand." I was riding a motorcycle at the time. I had fucked up clothes, and I ran and Stevie was there, and he was kind of pissed because the guys that they were supposed to do this weren't doing the job. And I had played that music. I was familiar with that music, right? I don't know how many times I had played Sir Duke. And then, Sir Duke became 3 more songs because he liked what he was hearing.
Wow.
So we did a total of 4 songs. That was Tony Bennett's 91st birthday party. But you got to be ready. I think you got to be ready and just become the best musician you can be. So when these things happen, and they can happen quickly, and on a high level, hopefully, you'll be ready to rock. So that should be a lesson, that it's more about becoming a great drummer. And if this thing comes your way or you want to move toward it, you have a lot to bring to the table.
Speaking of great drummers, a lot of people don't like to answer this question. I always preface that, but you might want to answer this question. If you had to pick your top 5 drummers of all time, who would that be? Or who would they be?
This question has become harder as I've gotten older, because when I was younger and when I came into the city, let's say, I was, you could hear so many great musicians all the time. The guys that were really influencing me back then. I mean, first, the guy that I remember being one of my heroes early on, there was Ringo. And then oddly, I'm all over the board here. There was, I became a Buddy fanatic. And then but as time went on, and I was listening to more, and I loved Billy Cobb, loved him. And then Tony Williams, when I heard, that was like my gateway record to jazz, was Miles Davis, 4 and More, and I heard Tony Williams, and I was like, oh my God. The working drummers in New York City, I call them the 3 Steves. So there was Gadd, there was Jordan, and Ferroni. They were all like doing gigs all the time around me. I could go hear them at any point. Guys like, Erskine. It was a rich, rich period, and lots of other great drummers. But, Gadd and Jordan and Ferroni were so special in their ways. It was of that time period, and the music being made in New York. When I first heard Steve Jordan, he was playing with the 24th Street Band, which ultimately became the Letterman Band. They were hugely successful in Japan, and people knew him in New York. It was Will Lee and Hiram Bullock and Steve Jordan and Clifford Carter. And then Paul Schaefer, brought Will and Hiram and Steve in. Anyway, those were guys I loved listening to. But as time has gone on, and I've embraced so many different kinds of drummers, and feels have become a thing. And I think when you're young, you don't really understand feel as much. You might respond to it, but you don't really know. But there are too many now to name.
I never knew that information about the Steve Jordan and Hiram and Will, the 24th Street Band. Were they playing?
Yeah. And when I was young, I used to go hear them at 7th Avenue South, which was a great club that had, great music all the time. And you could hear, like French Toast was a band that Wecco was playing in, and Peter Erskine would play there with, like Don Grolnick, and at 24th Street Band, and the Brecker Brothers would play. The Brecker Brothers co-owned the club. So, you could hear Sanborn there. You could hear Michelle Camilo, I think, and, but 24th Street Band, I used to go hear as much as I could. It was that band, and I remember being very young, and Will Lee was so kind to me back then. I mean, we've since become, we played together in a number of different circumstances, and I love playing with him. He's fantastic. But at that point, I was a kid, and I said, man, I love the 24th Street Band. He gave me the 3 24th Street Band records, which were made in Japan, and this was a great freaking band. And Hiram and Will developed their whole partnership thing. You could see that. They were the first guys I knew to play wireless, and they would dance all over the club and run outside on the street and still be playing while Jordan was holding down the fort, and Jordan was and is unbelievable. Now he's with the Stones and sounds fantastic. Anyway, those were early influences.
So tell me about why was the 24th Street Band? Were they doing something on 24th Street?
Oh, I think that one or more of them lived on 24th Street. I think that's what that was. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was a great band, man. So cool. One of the things I worry about with younger drummers is the whole, online thing. And I mean, you can learn a lot from people who are showing you stuff and playing. And people do a lot of with play alongs, and they post a lot of stuff with them playing alone. And I worry a lot about people who have come to music and sort of embrace music and are involved with music on a solitary level too much of the time. That's a fear I have. It's a communicative thing. It involves other people. How you play is directly affected by things you're hearing in the moment. If those moments are rehearsed, it has nothing to do with what you're going to be doing in the real world. So, just like when we're talking, what I say affects you, what you say affects me. Music is that. And people need to really, I think, keep that in mind now more than ever, because now more than ever, you can lose sight of that, can't you?
Endorsements that you have, you said you did the Yamaha, was it Yamaha Night at NAMM? What's it called
Yeah,
again?
Yamaha had Groove Night.
Groove
Yeah, I've
Night,
been a
yes.
Yamaha artist for a while, a long while, and Zildjian and ProMark drumsticks. Um, the heads that I'm using and have used for a while are attack heads. Um, it's always an eyebrow raiser because people think that they're kind of somehow cut rate heads, and they're not. But I like to use the word boutique. But anyway, they have a heads that are where they kind of get the material from the same place. The Mylar heads are from the same place that Remo does, and so I've been using attack heads for a long time, and those are my main endorsements.
What projects are you working on now? And do you have anything that you are promoting?
Well, so the things that I do now are sort of spread out amongst a few different artists and projects. So for the last few years, I've been playing the music for the Amazon series, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And I still am doing that. I'm also doing on-camera stuff. They have an on-camera band that will be for shown next season. Um, I so that is keeping me somewhat busy because they're kind of in full swing now. I work with Paul Schaefer, who was formerly the music director for the David Letterman show, and we've been doing his symphony shows. We just did one in Southern California in Long Beach. We did one in Vancouver. We're about to do one in another one in Canada. I hope that we'll bring it closer to home. I have a gig at Carnegie Hall coming up with the New York Pops. I guest with them sometimes. I love playing with them. Um, there's an artist named Brian Stokes Mitchell, who's a fantastic singer, and I'm in his band and work with him both with his small group and on orchestra shows. Um, I did I did one song for Steve Martin's show, Only Murders in the Building. So that's a song that was produced for that show. And Halston, there's a series Halston, and I worked on that. Then there's John Miller has a band, and I play in that band. And we play every few months. Tony Caniff, he's another bass player leader, and he has a band, and I play with that band. Larry Saltzman's in that band, by the way, and that's at the bitter end, and that's monthly. Those are the things that I'm doing right now, and recordings wherever and whenever. And I have a studio in my house here on the other side of this wall, and I do projects for people, and they send me their tracks, and I play along. Did a few of those records recently. That's me.
And where can people find you on social media?
So I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram. And I'm so lame, I don't have a website, but I do post stuff on Facebook and I make it public now almost all the time. That took me a while to figure that out. And Instagram, I'm putting stuff there. And when I have gigs, like I did one with a guitar player named Sean Harkness. We did a gig recently at Birdland, and I'll post about the gigs, the local gigs, the gigs that aren't local, before they happen, usually. So that's where I do that.
Great, because
Yeah,
sounds like you're doing amazing things, and you've done amazing things in the past, and you are an amazing person to talk to.
likewise.
And thank you.
Thank you, man. Thank you for having me on. It's great to be part of your podcast, and I think what you're doing is really noble and special, and goes beyond. You've uncovered something that was kind of nobody ever did this, for instance, for recording, I think, right? As an example. Well, I want to be a studio musician. Yeah, good luck. But what you're doing is uncovering the mystery, and so look. We've talked about so many of the factors. There are other factors. I have Jonathan Haas, who's the head of the percussion at NYU, and just a fantastic person and a learned teacher. And I once in a while I do something at NYU for him. It's a sort of master classes thing, and I start by telling people. Think about this very carefully. He says, don't do that. He says, you're just there to provide information and inspiration. And I embrace his point of view. But there's a part of me, because of who I am, that thinks, okay, this is what you want to do. You want to move to this first of all, shows generally don't run very long, right? Right, and there are loads of guys, great musicians, who have had shows and don't have them now, right? And then, so that's, then you're also talking about being in a city which is outrageously expensive, very dirty, very noisy, very angry, right? And overcrowded. I mean, if after all this you still want to do it, God bless, but think about it. If you have a piece of the pie somewhere and you're gigging and you're teaching and you're learning and you like where you are, New York is its own animal. You're taking something pretty heavy on, and there's lots of things going on between economics and politics and social things that are that make it more challenging than ever. So keep all of that in mind. The other thing that I think is also important to realize is that, and this happened with the jingle business, and I'm sorry, this is like a prologue, or is that, we're rather a monologue. But it would happen with the jingle business where it was centralized, and there were like 5 big jingle houses, right? And you could go to X, Y, and Z if you wanted to do those. They were the main. And then suddenly, everybody who had a computer became a jingle house, and the business became like factionalized and compartmentalized, and then suddenly there was no central thing. This has happened to Broadway too. Every show almost is a new power structure. It might be a new conductor, might be a new associate conductor, might be a new composer, might be a new orchestrator, right? Somebody, and the contractors that we know of, the guys you've interviewed, might not be involved until the nucleus of the band has already been formed. So this makes it that much more challenging, because it used to be the contractors could put you on shows with greater ease. Now the nucleus of the band might already be in existence before the contractors even brought on So these are all various things to keep in mind, you know. Uh, I just feel like it's important to know all of that, you know, and to, when you're making an informed decision. Also, be able to read well. There are a couple of guys who've gotten by based on the fact that they can play well, but they don't read well. And there are people who don't want to tolerate that. So, you know, get that together, you know. Touch will be,
Yes.
and no one wants to wait on you while you figure it out because you can't read particularly well.
Yeah. Especially when money's on the line and money is time is money,
Yep.
and they put something in front of you and they count things off. You just gotta sink or swim, and if you want
Yes,
to succeed, you better learn how to swim.
indeed.
Backstroke, side stroke.
You did. But, well, thank you again, man.
Yeah, it's great conversation, and looking forward to hanging one more time, or not one more time, many, many times over. And I'm
Yeah,
sure
yeah, for sure.
I'll
For
come check
sure.
you out whenever you're playing, and definitely keep me posted.
I sure will. Thank you so much, Clayton.
All right.
Appreciate it.
We'll talk soon.
All right, man. Be well.